My daughter-in-law thought the worst thing she could call me was the babysitter. She had no idea that word would cost her far more than she imagined. At Thanksgiving dinner, my daughter-in-law introduced me as the babysitter. She said it so casually that for a moment, I wondered if I had misheard her. The dining room was glowing with warm light. The big oak table was covered with dishes, golden roasted turkey, bowls of cranberry sauce, mashed potatoes with butter melting into the surface. The smell of sage and roasted garlic filled the air. Outside the windows, the late November sky was already turning dark. Thanksgiving had always been my favorite holiday. I had spent the entire morning cooking. Even though my daughter-in-law, Melissa, insisted she had everything under control, I still brought a few dishes. Old habits die hard. I made pumpkin pie the way my late husband Robert used to love it, with just a hint of cinnamon and nutmeg. I also brought a small tin of sugar cookies for my grandchildren. At 68, I had learned that showing up empty-handed to a family dinner felt wrong, even if you were technically just a guest. The house was full when I arrived. Melissa's parents were there, along with her younger sister and a few neighbors. My son Daniel was pouring wine at the kitchen counter, laughing at something someone said. For a moment, watching him, I felt that familiar warmth in my chest. He was 42 now, taller than his father ever was, with the same crooked smile he'd had as a boy. Sometimes when he laughed, I could almost see the 10-year-old who used to run into my arms after school. But those moments were becoming rarer. I hung my coat by the door and walked toward the dining room. My granddaughter Sophie ran up and hugged my legs. "Grandma, did you bring the cookies?" I laughed softly. Of course I did. Her little brother Ethan appeared behind her, already reaching for the tin in my hand. Children never change. Adults do. The dining table was set beautifully. Melissa had placed small decorative pumpkins between the plates and folded the napkins into neat little fans. It looked like something from a magazine. "Dinner's ready," she called from the kitchen. Everyone gathered around the table. I took the seat near the end, the one Melissa usually directed me toward. Not the head of the table. That spot was reserved for Daniel now, but close enough that I could see everyone. Wine glasses were filled. Plates were passed. For a few minutes, everything felt normal. People talked about work, about traffic, about the football game playing softly in the living room. Someone laughed about travel plans for Christmas. I listened quietly, smiling when someone looked my way. That was something I had learned over the years. If you stay quiet long enough, people forget you're there. Melissa suddenly stood up beside Daniel, holding her wine glass. "Before we start," she said brightly, "I want to introduce everyone properly." A few people chuckled, assuming she was joking. She gestured toward her parents first, thanking them for bringing the sweet potatoes. Then she introduced her sister's new boyfriend, who nodded awkwardly. And then she turned toward me. "And this," Melissa said with a wide smile, resting her hand lightly on my shoulder, "is Linda." For a brief second, I thought she might say something kind. Maybe Daniel's mother. Maybe the world's best grandma. Instead, she laughed softly and added, "Our babysitter." A couple of people at the table chuckled. Not loudly, just enough. The kind of laugh people give when they're not sure if something is a joke. I felt every eye in the room flick toward me. Melissa continued smiling, as if she had said something completely harmless. "She's amazing with the kids," she added lightly. "Honestly, we'd be lost without her." Someone across the table nodded approvingly. "That's wonderful," one of the neighbors said. I could hear the faint clink of silverware against plates as people shifted uncomfortably. My son didn't say anything. Daniel just took a sip of his wine. For a moment, the room felt strangely quiet. Not silent, just heavier. I could feel the familiar tightening in my chest, the kind that starts deep behind your ribs and slowly spreads upward. Babysitter. It was such a small word. And yet somehow it erased 42 years of motherhood in a single sentence. I had raised Daniel by myself after Robert passed away. I had worked double shifts at the hospital. I had sold my jewelry once just to make sure Daniel could stay in college. But none of that mattered now. To Melissa, I was the babysitter. Someone hired to entertain the children. Someone convenient. Someone temporary. For a few seconds, no one spoke. Then I slowly reached for my wine glass. The stem felt cool between my fingers. I lifted it gently, and I smiled. "To family," I said softly. A few people murmured the words back automatically. "To family." I took a slow sip of wine. Across the table, Melissa's smile widened, clearly pleased with herself. She thought I hadn't noticed. She thought I would swallow the insult the way I always had before. Maybe she believed I was too old to care, too quiet to fight, too grateful for scraps of attention. But as I set my glass back on the table, I felt something settle calmly inside me. Because what Melissa didn't know was that earlier that afternoon, before coming to dinner, I had already visited my lawyer. And the papers waiting in my purse would make this Thanksgiving the last time anyone in that room laughed at me. That night, after Thanksgiving dinner ended, I drove home slowly. The streets were almost empty. Most families were still gathered around their tables, finishing pie or watching football in warm living rooms filled with laughter. My car heater hummed quietly as I drove through the dark streets of Cedar Grove. I didn't turn on the radio. I just drove. The word babysitter echoed in my mind again and again, like the faint ringing of a bell you can't quite stop hearing. Babysitter. Such a harmless word on the surface. But words have weight, and sometimes they reveal more truth than people realize. When I pulled into my driveway, the porch light automatically flicked on, casting a soft yellow glow across the front steps. My house looked exactly the same as it had for the past 32 years. Robert and I bought this place when Daniel was 10. Back then the trees in the yard were barely taller than the fence. Now they towered above the roof, their branches stretching across the quiet street like old guardians. I turned off the engine and sat there for a moment. The silence inside the car felt peaceful, very different from the tension I had just left behind. Eventually, I picked up my purse from the passenger seat and stepped out. Cold November air brushed against my face as I walked toward the front door. Inside, the house greeted me with the familiar smell of cinnamon and old wood. I had lit a candle before leaving earlier that afternoon. It still flickered gently on the coffee table. The living room looked calm, orderly, safe. I hung my coat on the rack and placed my purse carefully on the side table. Then I sat down in Robert's old armchair. For a long time, I didn't move. The house felt larger at night, especially since Robert passed away 4 years ago. The silence wasn't uncomfortable anymore. In fact, I had grown to appreciate it. Silence doesn't judge you. Silence doesn't laugh. After a few minutes, I opened my purse and pulled out the envelope my lawyer had handed me earlier that afternoon. The thick paper made a quiet rustling sound. Inside were several documents. Legal documents. The kind people usually don't think about until it's too late. I placed them on the coffee table and looked at them for a moment. Earlier that day, I had sat in Mr. Henderson's office for nearly 2 hours. He had been Robert's attorney for over 20 years. After Robert passed away, he became mine as well. Mr. Henderson was a calm man with silver hair and patient eyes, the kind of man who spoke slowly and never rushed his sentences. When I walked into his office that afternoon, he looked up from his desk and smiled warmly. "Linda," he said, "it's been a while. What can I do for you?" I remember folding my hands neatly in my lap before speaking. "I'd like to make a few changes," I told him. He didn't ask many questions. Experienced lawyers rarely do. Instead, he simply opened a file drawer and took out a familiar folder. "Your will and property documents are already on file," he said. "What kind of changes are you considering?" I thought about Melissa, about the way she smiled tonight when she said babysitter, about Daniel's silence, and about the quiet assumptions they had both been making for years. "They believe this house belongs to Daniel," I said calmly. Mr. Henderson raised his eyebrows slightly. "Well, technically speaking, it doesn't," he replied. "Robert had been very careful when he wrote the original documents. The house had always been in my name. Always. But Daniel and Melissa didn't know that. Over the years, they had slowly begun treating the place like it was already theirs. Small comments at first, then bigger ones. Melissa once said casually, during dinner, "When we renovate the kitchen someday, I want white marble counters." Another time she had laughed and told a neighbor, "This house will be perfect for the kids once we move in." I had never corrected her. Sometimes silence is more revealing than confrontation. Mr. Henderson adjusted his glasses and slid a blank document across the desk. "What exactly would you like to change?" he asked. I thought about that question carefully, not out of anger, but out of clarity, because sometimes the most important decisions in life are made quietly, without anyone noticing. "I want to establish a living trust," I said. "And the house." I smiled faintly. "The house stays with me." Now, sitting in my living room that night, I looked down at those same documents resting on my coffee table. The candlelight flickered across the pages. Everything had been signed. Everything was official. No one in Daniel's house had any idea. They were probably still sitting around the table right now, finishing the last of the pumpkin pie. Melissa might even be telling another joke. Maybe another one about the babysitter. I leaned back in Robert's armchair and let out a slow breath. Outside, the wind moved softly through the tall trees in the yard. For the first time in a long while, I felt completely calm. Because Melissa thought she had embarrassed me tonight. She thought that one word had placed me beneath her. But what she didn't understand yet was that the babysitter had just rewritten the entire future of her family. The morning after Thanksgiving was quiet. Sunlight filtered softly through the kitchen window as I poured myself a cup of coffee. The same pale winter sunlight that had greeted me every morning for years. Some things in life remain steady. The coffee maker hummed gently. The smell of fresh coffee filled the kitchen. I carried the mug to the small wooden table near the window and sat down. Outside, frost clung lightly to the grass. The neighborhood was peaceful. A few houses still had Thanksgiving decorations on their porches, small pumpkins, faded orange leaves tied to railings. Life moved slowly in Cedar Grove. That was one of the reasons Robert and I loved it here. I wrapped both hands around the warm mug and took a sip. Then I looked at the empty chair across from me. Robert's chair, for years, had passed since he was gone, but sometimes I still caught myself glancing toward that spot, expecting him to walk into the kitchen and say something about the weather. He always liked cold mornings. Crisp air keeps you sharp, he used to say. I smiled faintly at the memory. Robert had a way of noticing things other people missed. Small shifts in behavior. Little signals hidden in everyday conversations. He trusted people, but he also watched them carefully. And over the years, he had grown cautious about Melissa. I remember one evening about 6 years ago. Daniel and Melissa had come over for dinner. It was early autumn, and Robert was standing at the grill in the backyard. Melissa had just finished telling us about a real estate listing she saw online. A house just like this one sold for nearly $800,000, she said casually, glancing around the dining room. Her tone sounded light. But Robert noticed. After they left that night, he came inside and sat down across from me at this very table. What do you think of Melissa? He asked. I remember laughing softly. She's Daniel's wife, I said. What kind of question is that? Robert didn't laugh. Instead, he leaned back in his chair and folded his arms. I think she sees things differently than we do, he said slowly. How so? He tapped his fingers lightly against the table. Melissa doesn't look at people, he said. She looks at what they have. At the time, I thought he was being overly cautious. Robert had always been protective of Daniel. But looking back now, I realized something important. Robert was rarely wrong about people. I finished my coffee and placed the mug in the sink. The house felt calm that morning. No noise. No tension. Just the quiet rhythm of an ordinary day. Around 9 o'clock, my phone buzzed on the counter. I glanced down at the screen. Daniel. For a moment, I considered letting it go to voicemail. But eventually, I answered. Good morning, I said. Daniel's voice sounded slightly tired. Morning, Mom. There was a short pause. Did you make it home okay last night? Yes, I replied calmly. Everything was fine. Another pause followed. The kind that usually appears when someone is searching for the right words. Then Daniel cleared his throat. Melissa said she might have joked a little too much. Last night, I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I reached for a dish towel and began drying the clean plates in the rack beside the sink. She didn't mean anything by it, he added quickly. Of course she didn't. That was always the explanation. Jokes, misunderstandings, harmless comments. But small words have a way of revealing large truths. I see, I said. Daniel sighed softly. You know how Melissa is. Yes, I did. Better than he realized. Because over the years, I had quietly watched the way Melissa operated inside the family. Not loudly, not aggressively. Melissa preferred subtlety. She worked through small shifts, little adjustments. She moved family gatherings to her parents' house. She slowly replaced old traditions with new ones. And little by little, she repositioned people, some closer to the center, others further away. I dried another plate, then another. You know, Daniel continued, the kids really love spending time with you. That sentence caught my attention. I turned slightly toward the phone. Do they? Of course, he said quickly. You're amazing with them. Amazing with them. Babysitter. The connection was almost too neat. I'm glad they enjoy visiting, I said. Daniel hesitated again. Well, actually, Melissa and I wanted to ask you something. There it was. Requests rarely arrive alone. They usually follow compliments. What is it? I asked. Well, Melissa is starting a new project at work next month. Her schedule's going to be pretty intense. I remained silent. And Sophie has gymnastics 3 days a week now, he continued. Plus Ethan's soccer practice. I leaned lightly against the counter. I see. So we were wondering, maybe you could help out a little more with the kids. A little more. That phrase floated quietly in the air between us. I looked out the kitchen window at the frost slowly melting off the grass. Somewhere down the street, a dog barked once. Then everything returned to silence. Finally, I spoke. Daniel, I said gently. Did Melissa explain who I am to the neighbors last night? He didn't answer right away. I continued calmly. Did she introduce me as your mother or your babysitter? On the other end of the phone, Daniel shifted uncomfortably. Mom, I let the silence stretch. Because silence, when used carefully, often says more than any argument. And in that moment, I could feel something subtle beginning to change. Daniel didn't know it yet, but the quiet woman he thought he understood was no longer playing the same role in his life. Daniel didn't answer my question right away. On the other end of the phone, I could hear him breathing quietly. The kind of slow, careful breathing people do when they're trying to avoid saying the wrong thing. Mom, he said finally, it was just a joke. I folded the dish towel neatly and placed it on the counter. A joke, I repeated. Yes, Melissa didn't mean anything by it. I walked back to the kitchen table and sat down. The morning sunlight had grown a little brighter now, spilling across the wooden surface where Robert and I used to eat breakfast together every day. Funny how certain places hold memories longer than people do. Daniel, I said calmly, how long have I been helping with the children? He hesitated. Well, since Sophie was born, I guess. Sophie was 9 now. 9 years. 9 years of school pickups. 9 years of early mornings when Melissa had meetings. 9 years of soccer practices, science projects, doctor's appointments, and late-night phone calls that always started the same way. Mom, are you busy? I could almost hear Daniel counting backward through those years on the other end of the line. You've helped a lot, he admitted. I nodded slowly, even though he couldn't see me. Yes, I said quietly. I have. There was another pause. Then Daniel spoke again, a little more carefully this time. Look, Mom, Melissa's just stressed lately. Work has been intense. She probably didn't think about how that comment sounded. Of course she did. Melissa always thought carefully about how things sounded. That was one of her greatest talents. She knew exactly which words sounded innocent enough to escape criticism, while still carrying the message she wanted people to hear. I didn't argue with Daniel. Instead, I looked out the window again. The frost on the lawn had melted completely now. The grass was damp and shining faintly in the sunlight. Change often happens quietly. First the frost, then the water, then the ground beneath it all. Daniel, I said after a moment, do you remember when you were 10 years old? He sounded confused. What? The summer we moved into this house. Oh yeah? I remember. Robert had spent weeks renovating the place before we moved in. Fresh paint. New cabinets. The hardwood floors polished until they shined. Daniel had run through every room that first day like he had just discovered a castle. This is my room, he kept asking. Yes, I said softly into the phone. Your room. Daniel chuckled faintly at the memory. Dad worked really hard on that house. Yes, I said. He did. Robert had loved this place. But what Daniel never fully understood was how carefully Robert had planned our future here. Robert believed in preparation, in making sure things were secure, in making sure no one could simply walk in and take what wasn't theirs. I spoke to Mr. Henderson yesterday, I said. Daniel immediately recognized the name. Dad's lawyer. Yes. The line went quiet again. Daniel was a smart man. He didn't need everything explained to him. Why? He asked cautiously. I traced my finger slowly across the wood grain of the table. Just updating some paperwork. Paperwork for what? For the house. Daniel inhaled softly. I could almost hear the calculations forming in his mind. The assumptions he had carried for years were beginning to shift. You're not sick, are you? He asked suddenly. I smiled. No, then why update the paperwork? That question hung gently in the air. Why indeed? Because sometimes people forget something important. They assume the future belongs to them, simply because they've been standing nearby long enough. Daniel, I said calmly, who do you think owns this house? There was a long pause. Well, it was Dad's house, he said. Yes. And when he passed, I figured, He stopped himself mid-sentence. Because suddenly the answer didn't sound as certain as it once had. I figured eventually it would, stay in the family. Stay in the family. Another harmless phrase. But phrases like that often hide quiet expectations. Expectations that slowly grow stronger over time. I leaned back in my chair. Robert left the house to me. I said gently. Daniel didn't speak. I've lived here for 32 years, I continued. And right now, the house still belongs to me. More silence. Not angry silence. Just thoughtful silence. And then Daniel said something that revealed exactly where his mind had gone. Well, of course it does, he said quickly. No one's saying it doesn't. I nodded again. I'm glad we agree. The kitchen clock ticked softly on the wall. For a moment neither of us spoke. Then Daniel cleared his throat. So, about helping with the kids. There it was again. Back to the original reason for the call. Back to the role Melissa had carefully assigned to me. Babysitter. I looked down at my hands resting quietly on the table. Hands that had raised a child. Hands that had worked long hospital shifts. Hands that had cooked hundreds of family dinners. And now, according to Melissa, hands that were apparently hired for childcare. Daniel, I said slowly, I've been thinking about that. Yeah. Yes. I let the words settle for a moment. Then I spoke again. And I believe it's time for a small change. On the other end of the line, Daniel sounded uncertain. What kind of change? I glanced toward the living room where the envelope from Mr. Henderson still rested on the coffee table. Everything had been signed. Everything had been filed. The future had already begun shifting quietly, the way frost melts before anyone notices. Well, I said calmly, if I'm going to be the babysitter, I paused gently, then we should probably start discussing my hourly rate. Daniel didn't respond right away. For a moment, the only sound on the phone was the faint static of the connection. My hourly rate, he repeated slowly. Yes, I said calmly. The words sounded strange even to my own ears. Not because they were wrong, but because they had never needed to be said before. For 9 years, I had simply helped. That was what mothers did. That was what grandmothers did. No one kept track of hours. No one asked questions. But roles have a way of changing once they are given names. And Melissa had given mine a name. Babysitter. Daniel let out a short laugh, though it sounded uneasy. Mom, you're joking, right? I stood up from the kitchen table and walked slowly toward the sink. The morning sun had climbed higher now, filling the room with soft light. No, I said gently. I'm not joking. Another pause followed. Well, Daniel struggled for the right words. You've always helped with the kids. It's never been about money. That's true, I replied. For a long time, it had never been about money. It had been about family, about helping, about love. But something changes when someone stands in front of a room full of people and introduces you as hired help. Words redefine relationships. You're their grandmother, Daniel said quickly, as if correcting something. Yes. And grandparents help with their grandkids. I dried my hands on the towel beside the sink. They do, I agreed. Another quiet moment passed. Then Daniel spoke again. So why are we talking about hourly rates? I walked slowly toward the living room. Robert's armchair sat by the window, just where it had always been. The envelope from Mr. Henderson was still on the coffee table beside it. I picked it up and held it lightly in my hand. Because, I said calmly into the phone, if I'm the babysitter, then it seems only fair. Daniel exhaled slowly. I think you're taking Melissa's comment a little too seriously. Perhaps. Or perhaps Melissa had finally said something honest. Over the years, I had watched the small ways my role in Daniel's household had shifted. At first, it was simple favors. Mom, could you watch Sophie for a couple hours? Mom, could you pick Ethan up from school? Then the requests became expectations. School pickups every Tuesday. Gymnastics drop-offs every Thursday. Last-minute calls whenever Melissa had a meeting. It happened gradually. So gradually that most people wouldn't notice. But Robert had once told me something important. Pay attention to patterns, he used to say. Patterns tell the truth people won't say out loud. And the pattern had been clear for years. I helped. Melissa benefited. And Daniel stayed comfortably in the middle. I've been thinking about it, I said. About what? Daniel asked. About balance. He sounded puzzled. What balance? I walked to the window and looked out at the quiet street. The wind had picked up slightly. A few dry leaves skittered across the pavement. The balance between what people give and what they receive, I explained. Daniel sighed softly. Mom, You're making this more complicated than it needs to be. Perhaps. Or perhaps I was finally making it clear. I'm simply adjusting the arrangement, I said. What arrangement? The one where I provide childcare. Daniel laughed again, though the sound carried a hint of irritation now. You're not running a daycare. No, I said quietly. I'm not. I sat down slowly in Robert's armchair. The leather creaked softly under my weight. But apparently I've been running a babysitting service. Daniel didn't reply. On the other end of the line, I could hear him shifting slightly, perhaps rubbing his forehead the way he used to when something frustrated him. Melissa didn't mean it that way, he insisted. Maybe not. But intentions matter less than patterns. And besides, he continued, you love spending time with the kids. I smiled faintly. I do. Sophie loved drawing pictures at my kitchen table. Ethan liked helping me water the garden in the summer. None of this was their fault. Children rarely understand the invisible negotiations adults create around them. But loving my grandchildren, I said gently, doesn't mean I should be introduced as hired help. Daniel didn't respond to that. Instead, he changed direction. So what exactly are you suggesting? He asked carefully. I opened the envelope in my hand and glanced briefly at the documents inside. Everything was already signed. Everything was already official. But Daniel didn't know that yet. I'm suggesting something very simple, I said. If Melissa wants a babysitter, I paused. Then she should probably treat me like one. What does that mean? It means schedules. It means notice before asking for help. And yes, I added softly, it means payment. Daniel was silent again. This silence was different from the earlier ones. Heavier. More thoughtful. Because slowly, piece by piece, the familiar arrangement he had relied on for years was beginning to shift. Melissa's not going to like that, he finally said. I nodded even though he couldn't see me. No, I agreed. She probably won't. Outside, a car drove slowly down the street. The sound faded quickly. Mom, Daniel began again. Yes. You're serious about this? Yes. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said something that revealed exactly what Melissa had always believed. But, you have plenty of time. I leaned back in the chair. Time. That was the assumption. That retired people simply had endless hours waiting to be filled. That their lives existed mainly for the convenience of others. But time is still valuable, even when people pretend it isn't. Yes, I said calmly. I do have time. I let the words settle gently. And that's exactly why I get to decide how I spend it. After I hung up the phone with Daniel, the house became quiet again. Not the uncomfortable kind of quiet. The peaceful kind. I placed the phone on the coffee table and leaned back in Robert's chair. The leather was worn. In the same places it had been for years, shaped by familiar evenings and long conversations. Outside, the wind had picked up. Late November always carried that dry, restless feeling in the air. The kind that reminds you winter is coming whether you're ready or not. I folded the documents from Mr. Henderson and slid them back into the envelope. Then I set the envelope in the drawer beside the chair. No rush. Everything that needed to happen had already been set in motion. People often imagine big changes happening loudly. Arguments. Dramatic confrontations. Doors slamming. But the most powerful changes usually happen quietly. Paperwork. Signatures. A few calm decisions made in a quiet office. That afternoon passed peacefully. I watered the plants in the kitchen window. I read a few chapters from the mystery novel sitting on my nightstand. And around 4 o'clock, I took a slow walk through the neighborhood. Cedar Grove was the kind of town where people still waved when they passed each other on the sidewalk. Mrs. Alvarez from 2 houses down was putting up early Christmas lights when I walked by. Evening, Linda, she called. Evening. Her grandson was on the lawn helping untangle the lights. He waved at me shyly. Small moments like that remind you something important. Respect doesn't come from age alone. It comes from how people choose to see you. When I returned home, the sun had already started to sink behind the trees. The sky glowed pale orange through the bare branches. Inside the house, everything felt warm and familiar. I had just finished heating a small bowl of soup when my phone buzzed again. This time, Melissa's name appeared on the screen. I let it ring twice before answering. Hello. Melissa's voice sounded tight. Not angry, but controlled. Linda, she said. She rarely called me Mom. Hi, Melissa. I just spoke with Daniel. I figured you might. A brief silence followed. I think there's been a misunderstanding, she said. I carried my soup to the table and sat down. What kind of misunderstanding? Well, Melissa said carefully, Daniel mentioned something about you asking to be paid for watching the kids. Yes. The spoon touched the side of the bowl with a soft clink. Another pause. Linda, you know that's not how our family works. Our family. That phrase again. People like Melissa use phrases like that very carefully. They sound warm, but they usually mean something specific. Our family, I repeated calmly. Yes, she continued. We all help each other. I blew gently across the soup. Steam curled upward into the quiet kitchen. That's true, I said. Exactly. Melissa replied quickly, relieved that I seemed to agree. But helpers usually receive respect in return, I added. The line went quiet. I could almost picture Melissa standing in her kitchen, arms crossed, trying to decide how to steer the conversation back to familiar ground. You know I respect you, she said finally. I didn't respond immediately. Respect is easy to claim, much harder to demonstrate. Melissa, I said after a moment, how did you introduce me yesterday? Another silence. Longer this time. It was just a joke, she said again. Yes. The same explanation Daniel had offered earlier. The thing about jokes is that they often tell the truth people don't want to say directly. I'm sorry if you took it the wrong way, Melissa added. That sentence was carefully chosen. Not an apology, just a repositioning. I took another spoonful of soup. It sounded very clear to me. I said. Melissa's tone sharpened slightly. Well, I certainly didn't expect it to turn into a business negotiation. I smiled faintly. Neither did I. Another pause followed. Then Melissa changed tactics. Look, she said. The kids love spending time with you. Yes, they do. And you love them. Of course. So why complicate things? Because simplicity sometimes hides unfair arrangements. Because kindness shouldn't be mistaken for obligation. But I didn't say those things out loud. Instead, I asked a simple question. Melissa, do babysitters get paid? She hesitated. Well, yes. Then the title seems accurate. I could almost hear her exhale through her teeth. You're really going to push this? Push. Interesting word. As if asking for respect meant applying pressure. I'm simply accepting the role you assigned, I said calmly. Silence filled the line again. Outside the window, the last of the daylight was fading. Streetlights flickered on one by one along the road. Finally, Melissa spoke again. Her voice sounded cooler now. Well, she said, maybe we should rethink how often the kids come over. There it was. The first shift in the arrangement. People often reveal their priorities the moment something costs them. I set my spoon down gently. That's entirely your decision, I replied. You're okay with that? Yes. Because something Melissa still didn't understand was that my life didn't revolve around her schedule. For years, I had adjusted my time around their needs. Now the balance was shifting. Quietly. Naturally. Well, Melissa said stiffly, we'll figure something out. I'm sure you will. The conversation lingered for another second. Then she ended the call. I placed the phone down beside the bowl and leaned back in my chair. The kitchen felt calm. Outside, the streetlights glowed softly along the quiet road. And somewhere in Daniel's house, I imagined Melissa explaining the conversation to him, trying to understand why something so predictable had suddenly become uncertain. Because the babysitter they had always relied on had just stopped working for free. For the next few days, things were quiet. Not peaceful quiet. Careful quiet. The kind that settles over a situation when everyone involved is trying to figure out their next move. Daniel didn't call again that evening. Melissa didn't either. And the house felt exactly the way it always did when life paused for a moment before shifting direction. On Saturday morning, I woke up early. Habit. Years of hospital shifts trained my body to wake before sunrise, even though I retired nearly 6 years ago. The sky outside was still dark when I walked into the kitchen and started the coffee maker. The familiar sounds filled the room, the gentle drip of coffee, the soft hum of the refrigerator. Small sounds that make a house feel alive. I carried my mug to the window and looked out at the street. A light frost had returned overnight. Winter was getting closer. As I stood there, my phone buzzed on the counter. A message from Daniel. Mom, can we stop by later today? Short. Careful. I took a sip of coffee before replying. Of course. An hour later, another message arrived. Around 2. I didn't ask what they wanted to talk about. Some conversations explain themselves once people walk through the door. The morning passed slowly. I vacuumed the living room, watered the plants again, and around noon, I took out a small tin of cookies I had baked earlier in the week. Sophie loved chocolate chip. Ethan preferred oatmeal raisin. Children notice those kinds of details. Adults rarely do. By the time the clock reached 2 o'clock, the sky outside had turned gray. The kind of pale winter. Gray that flattens the light across everything. Right on time, Daniel's car pulled into the driveway. I watched from the window as he stepped out. Melissa followed. The children stayed in the back seat. Interesting. Usually they rushed straight to the door. Today they waited. I opened the front door before they had a chance to knock. "Hi," Daniel said. "Hello." Melissa stood beside him, arms folded lightly. "Linda," she said, the same careful tone she used on the phone. "Come in." They stepped inside, bringing a small gust of cold air with them. Daniel glanced around the living room the way people do when they're trying to read the atmosphere of a place. The house looked exactly the same. Nothing dramatic had changed. But sometimes people feel tension even when they can't see it. "Kids can come in," I said. Melissa hesitated. "They're fine in the car." I nodded. Of course. This wasn't a family visit. This was a conversation. Daniel cleared his throat. "Mom, we wanted to talk." "Yes." We moved into the living room. Daniel sat on the couch. Melissa chose the armchair across from him. Robert's chair. She didn't know that. But the moment she sat down, something about it felt inappropriate. Some chairs belong to certain people, even years later. "So," Daniel began, rubbing his hands together. "We've been thinking about what you said." "About the babysitting?" "Yes." Melissa leaned forward slightly. "We understand that the comment at Thanksgiving upset you." "Upset." That word again. It's amazing how people shrink events when they retell them. "I wasn't upset," I said calmly. They both looked surprised. "You weren't?" Daniel asked. "No," I folded my hands in my lap. "I was informed." Daniel frowned slightly. "Informed about what?" "About how Melissa sees me." Melissa shifted in the chair. "That's not fair, isn't it?" Her jaw tightened slightly. "I already explained that it was a joke." "Yes." I let the words sit there quietly. "Daniel told me you want to charge us for watching the kids," she continued. "Yes." Daniel spoke quickly. "Mom, we're just trying to understand where this is coming from." I looked at him carefully. The same boy I used to pack lunches for every morning. The same boy who used to fall asleep on the couch during Saturday cartoons. Life changes people. Sometimes slowly. Sometimes without them realizing it. "It's coming from clarity," I said. Melissa shook her head. "This is ridiculous." "Is it?" "Yes." She leaned forward. "Families don't charge each other for help." I tilted my head slightly. "Babysitters do." Silence. Daniel rubbed the back of his neck. "Mom, yes. You know Melissa didn't mean to disrespect you." I looked at him. Really looked. "Daniel," I said quietly, "when someone tells you who they think you are, believe them." Melissa crossed her arms. "I think you're blowing this way out of proportion." "Perhaps." I stood up slowly and walked toward the window. Outside, the children were still sitting in the car. Sophie had her face pressed against the glass. Ethan was playing with something in his hands. They had no idea what was happening inside. Children rarely do. Behind me, Daniel spoke again. "So what happens now?" I turned back toward them. What happens now? A simple question. But the answer had already begun forming days ago in Mr. Henderson's office. Quiet decisions. Careful paperwork. Small shifts that would change everything. "For now," I said calmly. "Things continue as they are." Melissa narrowed her eyes. "What does that mean?" "It means if you need a babysitter." I paused gently. "You can call me." Daniel looked relieved. Melissa looked suspicious. "And the hourly rate?" she asked. I smiled slightly. "That depends," I said. "On what?" I looked at both of them carefully. "On whether you're asking the babysitter," I paused, "or speaking to your mother." The room went very quiet. And for the first time since Thanksgiving dinner, Daniel looked genuinely uncertain about which one he had been dealing with all along. For a few seconds after I spoke, no one said anything. The room felt still. Daniel looked from me to Melissa, as if trying to figure out how the conversation had slipped somewhere unfamiliar. Melissa was the first to move. She leaned back in the chair and crossed her arms. "Well," she said, "I think we've heard enough." Her voice carried that same calm sharpness I had heard before. The kind that sounds polite on the surface, but leaves very little room for disagreement. Daniel shifted slightly beside her. "Melissa," but she continued speaking. "If Linda doesn't want to help with the kids anymore, that's her choice." I noticed she didn't say Mom. She never did when she was annoyed. I nodded gently. "That's correct." Melissa stood up. "Then I guess we'll make other arrangements." Her tone suggested something final. Something meant to close the subject. Daniel looked uncomfortable now. Mom didn't say she wouldn't help, he said quietly. Melissa turned toward him. She literally asked to be paid. The word literally landed in the room like a small stone. Daniel rubbed his forehead. Let's just slow down a second. But Melissa had already moved toward the door. I'll get the kids, she said. And just like that, the conversation paused. Daniel remained seated on the couch, staring at the floor for a moment. Then he looked up at me. I didn't think this would turn into such a big thing. I sat down again in the chair across from him. Neither did I. Outside, I could hear the car door open. Children's voices drifted faintly through the cold air. Daniel sighed. Melissa's under a lot of pressure at work. Yes. And the kids' schedules are crazy lately. I know. He looked around the room. The same room he had grown up in. The same walls that held school photos, family pictures. The old clock Robert had repaired 3 different times over the years. Things are just busy right now, he said. Busy. That word had quietly become the explanation for everything in modern life. Busy meant traditions disappeared. Busy meant family dinners got postponed. Busy meant respect sometimes got misplaced. I watched Daniel carefully. You're a good father, I said. He looked surprised. Thank you. You work hard. I try. He leaned forward slightly. And the kids love coming here. I know. For a moment, the conversation softened. But some realities don't stay soft for long. Daniel cleared his throat. So what happens if Melissa finds someone else to watch them? The question sounded casual, but the answer mattered more than he realized. That would be perfectly fine, I said. He blinked. You'd be okay with that? Yes. Daniel studied my face, as if trying to see something hidden there. For years, he had assumed something simple. That my time would always be available. That my house would always be open. That my help would always appear when needed. Those assumptions had quietly shaped the rhythm of his life. Now those rhythms were shifting. Mom, he said carefully, are you sure this is really about the babysitter thing? I tilted my head slightly. What else would it be about? He hesitated. I don't know. It just feels bigger. Sometimes children sense changes before they understand them. Yes, I said. It is bigger. Daniel looked confused. Bigger how? I didn't answer right away. Instead, I stood and walked toward the fireplace. Above it hung an old photograph. Robert standing beside a younger Daniel in the front yard. Both of them smiling. Daniel had lost his front tooth that summer. Robert looked proud. He loved this house, I said quietly. Daniel followed my gaze. Yeah. He worked very hard to make sure it stayed in the family. Daniel nodded. I know. I turned back toward him. But staying in the family doesn't always mean what people assume it means. Daniel frowned slightly. What do you mean? Before I could answer, the front door opened again. Melissa stepped inside with the children. Sophie ran straight toward me. Grandma. She hugged my waist tightly. I bent down and kissed the top of her head. Hello, sweetheart. Ethan walked in more slowly, holding a small toy truck. Hi, Grandma. Hi, Ethan. Children move through tension like sunlight through clouds. They notice feelings, but they don't fully understand them. Melissa watched the moment quietly from the doorway. Then she spoke. We should go. Daniel stood up. Already? Yes. Her tone made it clear the visit was over. Daniel looked at me one more time. Mom, we'll figure this out. I nodded. I'm sure you will. Sophie looked confused. But we just got here. Melissa gently took her hand. We'll visit another day. Another day. Promises like that often sound different depending on who says them. They walked toward the door. Cold air slipped inside again as Melissa opened it. Before stepping outside, Daniel turned back. Love you, Mom. I love you too. The door closed softly behind them. Through the window, I watched them walk to the car. Sophie waved. I waved back. Then the car pulled out of the driveway and disappeared down the quiet street. The house returned to silence. I stood there for a long moment. Not sad. Not angry. Just thoughtful. Because sometimes the moment people believe they've ended a conversation is actually the moment the real story begins. The next week passed quietly. Too quietly. The kind of quiet that feels deliberate. Daniel didn't call. Melissa didn't call. And for the first time in nearly 9 years, no one asked if I could pick up Sophie from gymnastics or take Ethan to soccer practice. My phone remained still on the kitchen counter. At first, I noticed the silence. Then, after a few days, I began to appreciate it. Monday morning, I woke up early as usual. The sky outside was pale gray, and a thin layer of frost covered the lawn again. Winter was settling in. I brewed coffee and sat by the window, the The same place I had sat hundreds of mornings before. Only this time, there was no schedule waiting for me. No school pickup at 3. No last-minute message asking if I could just watch the kids for a couple hours. Just quiet. I took a slow sip of coffee. Time has a strange way of expanding when no one is claiming it. By Wednesday afternoon, the house felt lighter. Not empty, just calmer. I spent the morning reorganizing the hallway closet. In the afternoon, I drove to the library downtown. Cedar Grove's library is small, but it's one of the nicest buildings in town. Brick walls, tall windows, and the smell of old paper that somehow makes a room feel peaceful. I checked out 2 novels and a gardening book. On my way home, I stopped at a small cafe near the town square. The barista recognized me. "Usual tea, Linda?" "Yes, please." I sat by the window while people moved quietly along the sidewalk outside. For the first time in a long while, I felt something simple. Freedom. Not dramatic freedom. Just the gentle kind that appears when obligations quietly disappear. But silence doesn't stay silent forever. Friday evening, my phone rang. "Daniel." I watched the screen for a moment before answering. "Hi, Daniel." "Hey, Mom." His voice sounded tired. "Everything okay?" I asked. Yeah. A short pause followed. Then he sighed. "You were right." That caught my attention. "About what?" "About how much time you've been spending with the kids." I leaned back in my chair. "What happened?" "Well," Daniel said, "Melissa found someone to help." "I see." At first it seemed fine. Of course it did. "Who did she hire?" I asked. "A college student from the neighborhood." That made sense. College students are reliable. "For a while." "She charges $20 an hour," he added. I nodded slowly. "That sounds reasonable." Daniel laughed quietly. "Yeah, that's what Melissa said too." Another pause. But Sophie's gymnastics schedule alone is 3 afternoons a week." "Yes. And Ethan's soccer practice is 2 evenings." "I remember. And Melissa's meetings run late most days." I could hear him doing the math out loud. $20 an hour adds up fast. I didn't say anything. Sometimes silence helps people reach their own conclusions. "We didn't really think about it before," he admitted. "No, because you were always there." That was the heart of it. Availability. People get used to something that never seems to run out. "Mom," Daniel said carefully, "have you been busy this week?" I smiled faintly. "I've been enjoying my time." "That's good." "Yes." He hesitated again. Then he said something honest. "The kids miss you." I felt a small warmth in my chest. "They can visit any time." "That's not the same," he said. "Perhaps not. But some differences matter." "Melissa's been stressed," he continued. "I imagine she has. And Sophie keeps asking why Grandma isn't picking her up anymore." Children notice patterns quickly, even when adults pretend nothing has changed. "What did you tell her?" I asked. Daniel paused. "I told her Grandma's busy." I chuckled softly. "That's not entirely wrong." He laughed too. But the laugh didn't last long. "Mom, Melissa might call you." "I see. About the kids." "Of course she might. Patterns have a way of circling back once reality catches up." "That's fine," I said calmly. "You'd still help." I looked around my quiet living room. The clock on the wall ticked gently. Outside, a light snow had begun to fall, tiny flakes drifting slowly through the evening air. "I'm always happy to see my grandchildren," I said. Daniel sounded relieved. "Good. But," I added softly, "I imagine the babysitter will still be available." The line went quiet. Daniel understood the meaning. "Yes," he said slowly. "I suppose she will." We talked for another minute. Nothing dramatic. Just small things about the weather and the kids' school. When the call ended, I set the phone down beside me. Outside the window, the snow continued falling gently. Some changes arrive suddenly. Others arrive quietly. But once people experience life without something they took for granted, they begin to understand its true value. And somewhere in Daniel's house that evening, Melissa was probably discovering exactly how expensive a babysitter could be. 2 days later, Melissa called. It was late afternoon. The sky outside had already turned that soft winter blue that appears just before sunset. I was in the kitchen slicing apples for a small pie when my phone buzzed on the counter. Her name appeared on the screen. I wiped my hands on a towel and answered. "Hello." Melissa's voice sounded different this time. Less sharp, less certain. "Linda," she said. "Yes." There was a short pause. "How are you?" The question sounded polite, but also slightly unfamiliar, like someone trying to restart a conversation they didn't quite know how to approach. "I'm doing well," I replied. That's good. Another pause followed. Through the phone, I could hear faint background noise. Probably their kitchen. A cabinet door closing somewhere. Then Melissa cleared her throat. Daniel told me you two spoke the other night. Yes. And he mentioned that you've been enjoying some time to yourself. I have. The apples rested neatly on the cutting board in front of me. Outside the window, the streetlights had just flickered on. Melissa hesitated again. Well, she said carefully, things have been busy here. I waited. Because when someone begins a sentence like that, the rest usually arrives on its own. The new babysitter is nice, she continued. I'm glad. But college schedules are unpredictable. Of course they are. And the kids have a lot going on. Yes. Gymnastics, soccer, school events. I let her list continue without interrupting. Finally, she said the sentence she had been working toward. We were wondering if maybe you could help again next week. I picked up one of the apple slices and placed it gently into the pie dish. How often? I asked. Well, she said, thinking. Maybe just a few afternoons. A few. Yes. I nodded slowly, though she couldn't see me. And the babysitter? We'll still use her sometimes. Of course they would. After all, she was the official one. The paid one. Melissa, I said calmly. Are you asking your babysitter or Daniel's mother? The question rested quietly in the air. Melissa didn't answer immediately. I'm asking you, she said. Yes, I replied gently. But which one? Because the answer mattered. Roles shape expectations. Expectations shape behavior. On the other end of the phone, Melissa exhaled softly. Linda, her voice sounded slightly tired now. I think this whole situation has gotten a little complicated. Perhaps. Or perhaps it had simply become honest. For years you helped with the kids, she continued. And it was wonderful. Yes. And I may have joked the wrong way at Thanksgiving. That was the closest she had come to acknowledging it. I didn't correct her. Sometimes partial recognition is enough. But I don't want things to feel transactional, she added. Transactional. An interesting word. It suggested she preferred the previous arrangement. The one where my time had no price. I understand, I said. You do? Yes. Because I did. I understood exactly why the old arrangement had worked so well for her. It had been very convenient. But Melissa, I continued softly, roles matter. Another pause. You keep saying that, she replied. Yes. Why? I placed the last apple slice into the pie dish and wiped the counter clean. Because once a role is defined, people begin treating it seriously. Because clarity changes behavior. Because the moment someone names you something, they reveal how they see you. Because once someone introduces you as the babysitter, I said calmly, you begin to understand the position they've placed you in. Melissa didn't speak. The silence stretched for several seconds. Then she said something more honest than anything before. The kids really miss you. I smiled faintly. They can visit anytime. That's not what I mean. Of course it wasn't. What she meant was structure, routine, reliability, the quiet support system that had always been there. Melissa, I said gently, if the children want to come over after school sometimes, they're always welcome. But they can visit their grandmother. The distinction was small, but important. And if you need a babysitter, I added calmly, you already hired one. Melissa didn't respond right away. When she finally spoke, her voice sounded thoughtful. So you're really separating those two things? Yes. A grandmother is family. A babysitter is staff. Two different roles. Two different expectations. Daniel said something similar, she admitted quietly. I wasn't surprised. Daniel had begun understanding the difference too. Well, Melissa said after a moment, maybe Sophie and Ethan could come by this weekend. They'd enjoy that. Yes, they would. The conversation softened after that. No arguments. No tension. Just quiet understanding settling into place. When we hung up, I placed the phone back on the counter and slid the pie into the oven. The kitchen filled slowly with the smell of cinnamon and warm apples. Outside, snow had begun falling again. Soft, steady, and for the first time since Thanksgiving dinner. Everyone seemed to understand exactly who I was. Not the babysitter, not hired help, just the grandmother, who finally decided to stop working for free. Saturday afternoon arrived quietly. The snow that had fallen earlier in the week was still resting lightly across the lawns in Cedar Grove. Not deep enough to cause trouble, just enough to soften the streets and rooftops. Winter had finally settled in. Inside my house, the kitchen smelled warm again. cinnamon, vanilla, and a fresh batch of cookies cooling on the counter. Old habits return easily when children are visiting. At around 3 o'clock, I heard the familiar sound of a car pulling into the driveway. Through the window, I saw Daniel's SUV. Sophie jumped out of the back seat before the engine had even stopped running. Some things never change. I opened the door just as she ran up the walkway. Grandma. She threw her arms around me. I laughed softly and hugged her back. Well, hello there. Ethan followed more calmly, carrying his small backpack. Hi, Grandma. Hi, sweetheart. Daniel stepped out of the car last. Melissa remained in the passenger seat. That told me something. This visit was for the children, not another negotiation. Daniel walked up the steps and gave me a quick hug. Thanks for doing this, Mom. You're welcome. Melissa lowered the window slightly. They'll only stay a couple hours, she said. Her tone was polite. Careful. That's fine, I replied. She nodded once. Then Daniel leaned down to the window and said something quietly to her before she drove away. I watched the car disappear down the street. Then I turned back to the children. Who wants cookies? 2 hands shot up immediately. Children always know what matters. Soon the house filled with the familiar sounds I had missed over the past week. Sophie sitting at the kitchen table drawing pictures. Ethan pushing his toy truck slowly across the floor. The small noises of childhood. Light. Uncomplicated. I poured them each a glass of milk and set the cookies on a plate. So, Sophie said between bites. Dad says you've been busy. I smiled. Busy in a peaceful way. She thought about that for a moment. I missed coming here after school. I miss seeing you. Ethan looked up from the floor. Mom said you have a babysitter. Now. I chuckled softly. No, sweetheart. I don't. He frowned slightly. Then why didn't you pick us up? Children always ask direct questions. Adults tend to circle around them. I crouched down beside him. Sometimes grown-ups need to figure things out, I explained gently. Oh, that seemed to satisfy him. Children accept simple answers more easily than adults do. The afternoon passed quickly. We played a board game. Sophie insisted on teaching me the new rules she had learned at school. Ethan built a small tower of toy blocks in the living room. And for a while, the house felt exactly the way it used to. Warm, alive, comfortable. Around 5 o'clock, headlights appeared through the front window again. Melissa's car. Sophie groaned. Already. I smiled. Time moves fast. A moment later the doorbell rang. Daniel stood on the porch when I opened it. Hey, he said. Hi. Melissa remained in the car again. I noticed that. Patterns are interesting things. They tell you how situations are evolving. The children gathered their backpacks and coats. Bye, Grandma, Ethan said. Bye, sweetheart. Sophie hugged me again. Can we come back tomorrow? Maybe next weekend. She nodded happily. Daniel watched the moment quietly. When the children walked toward the car, he stayed on the porch. Mom, he said. Yes. He rubbed the back of his neck. You were right about something. About what? About roles. I waited. Daniel looked out toward the street where the kids were climbing into the back seat. When you weren't picking them up this week, he said slowly, things felt different. Different how? Harder. He laughed quietly. I guess we got used to things being easy. That was honest. And honesty is often the first sign that people are beginning to understand. You did a lot for us, he added. I nodded. I was happy to. He looked at me carefully. I should have said something at Thanksgiving. I didn't respond immediately. Apologies don't always need long conversations. Sometimes recognition is enough. I appreciate that, I said. Daniel nodded slowly. Then he said something simple. You're not the babysitter. I smiled faintly. No, he gave a small laugh. I think Melissa understands that now too. That part interested me. Oh. He shrugged slightly. When the babysitter invoice came this week, reality got pretty clear. I chuckled softly. Yes. Reality tends to arrive in practical ways. Daniel looked relieved. Now, the tension from earlier in the week seemed lighter. Anyway, he said, thanks for today. You're welcome. He stepped down from the porch. Halfway to the car, he turned back. Love you, Mom. I love you too. Then he got in the car and drove away. The street returned to quiet again. I closed the front door and walked back into the living room. The toy blocks Ethan had left behind were still scattered on the rug. Sophie's drawing sat on the coffee table. It was a picture of our house, with 3 stick figures standing outside. Her, Ethan, and me. No babysitter. Just family. And sometimes, that's the role that matters most. Winter settled fully over Cedar Grove after that. The snow came slowly at first. A few quiet storms drifting across the rooftops, softening the streets and covering the lawns in a pale white blanket. The town always looked calmer in winter. Quieter, like the world had decided to slow down for a while. Life found a new rhythm after Thanksgiving. Not dramatic, not tense, just different. Daniel and Melissa adjusted their schedule. The college babysitter still came a few afternoons each week, driving her small blue car into their driveway around 3 o'clock. And on weekends, the children visited me, not as part of someone else's plan, just because they wanted to. Saturday afternoons became our tradition. Sometimes we baked cookies. Sometimes we worked on Sophie's art projects at the kitchen table. Ethan liked helping me shovel the walkway after it snowed. His small plastic shovel barely moved any snow, but he took the job very seriously. Children like having responsibilities. They like feeling important. One Saturday in late January, Sophie sat across from me at the table coloring quietly. "Grandma," she said. "Yes. Mom doesn't call you the babysitter anymore." I smiled softly. "That's good." She nodded thoughtfully. "Dad said that was a mistake." I looked down at the mug of tea in my hands. Steam curled gently into the warm kitchen air. "Yes," I said. "Sometimes people say things they shouldn't." Sophie continued coloring. After a moment, she added something else. "But Mom said you're the one who helped Dad when he was little." That made me pause. What did she say exactly? She said you worked a lot and still took care of everything. Children repeat what they hear. Sometimes those small echoes reveal quiet changes inside a family. "I did my best," I said. Sophie nodded. Then she held up her drawing. "Look." It was another picture of the house. This one had more detail. Trees, snow, the front porch, and 3 stick figures again. Her, Ethan, and me. "What about your parents?" I asked gently. "They're inside," she said matter-of-factly. That made me laugh. Fair enough. Later that afternoon, Daniel came to pick them up. The sun was already beginning to set when his car pulled into the driveway. Winter sunsets in Cedar Grove arrive early. Daniel stepped inside and stamped the snow from his boots. "Cold out there," he said. "Yes." He watched Sophie gather her drawings from the table. "You two had fun?" "Grandma helped me with my art project," Sophie said proudly. Daniel looked at the drawing she was holding. Then he smiled. "She's good at that." "Yes, she is." Ethan ran past us toward the door, already halfway into his coat. Daniel lingered in the kitchen for a moment. "You know," he said quietly, "things are better lately." "Yes." Melissa's been thinking about what happened. I didn't ask for details. Sometimes reflection happens slowly. Sometimes it needs space. She realized something. Daniel continued. "What's that?" "That people don't usually keep helping forever if they feel disrespected." That sounded like a useful lesson. I nodded gently. "She's trying," he added. "I'm glad." Daniel looked around the kitchen. The same cabinets. The same table. The same window Robert had installed himself all those years ago. "You and Dad built a good life here," he said. "We tried. And you kept everything together." That was a generous way to describe it. Families are rarely as simple as they appear from the outside. But effort matters. Consistency matters. Respect matters. "Mom," Daniel said after a moment. "Yes." I should have spoken up that night. I looked at him carefully. "But you understand now," I said. "Yes." Sometimes understanding arrives late. But it still counts. Daniel nodded slowly. Then he picked up Ethan's backpack. "We should get going." I walked them to the door. Cold evening air slipped inside when it opened. Sophie hugged me again. "See you next Saturday." "I'll be here." Ethan waved his mitten-covered hand. "Bye, Grandma." "Bye, sweetheart." They climbed into the car. Daniel started the engine. Before pulling away, he rolled down the window. "Mom," he called. "Yes." He smiled slightly. "Thanks for everything." I nodded. "You're welcome." The car pulled away down the quiet street. Snow crunched softly under the tires. I stood on the porch for a moment watching the taillights disappear around the corner. Then I stepped back inside. The house felt warm, comfortable, peaceful. I walked into the living room and sat down in Robert's old chair. For a while I simply listened to the quiet. The same quiet that had filled the house the night after Thanksgiving. Only now it felt different. Not lonely, just calm. Because sometimes the smallest moment reveals the biggest truth. A single word at a dinner table. A laugh that goes a little too far. A role that suddenly gets named out loud. Babysitter. I had raised my glass that night and smiled. And in the end, that small moment changed something important. Not the love inside our family. That was still there. But the understanding. The boundaries. The quiet respect that had been missing for a while. Sometimes people need to see what life looks like without you, before they remember who you really are. And in my case, the lesson turned out to be very simple. I was never the babysitter. I was the mother, the grandmother. And this house, this life we built here, was never something I needed to earn by working for free. Sometimes all it takes is one calm moment to remind people exactly where you belong.